young teacher, the subject of schoolgirl fantasy. She wants him so badly, knows what she wants.
This video will broadly define intertextuality and use intertextuality as a lens to understand the explication assignment and the research proposal. Intertextuality is the theory that we will use to better our understanding of the writing and research process. So it's important to understand that Julia Kristeva coined the term intertextuality back in the 1960s, but I like to use a couple different definitions. I like to use a broad definition by Charles Bazerman, and then I like to use a couple other definitions by Bazerman and James Porter that get into more specific aspects of intertextuality. This quote by Bazerman basically says that everything that we've seen, read, or experienced shapes the way we create text, and it also shapes the way we understand text. We reference text to help us make sense of other text, and everything is connected. You don't just come up with ideas out of thin air. You come up with ideas that are connected to other ideas. James Porter is a writing studies scholar that wrote an article about intertextuality and discourse communities. And in this article, he argues that intertextuality breaks down into two types: presupposition and irritability. Irritability is the repeating of certain textual fragments, like allusions, quotes, references, cliches, and presupposition is a little bit more difficult. It's the intertextuality that's sort of behind the scenes, ideas and assumptions that the text makes about its reader's knowledge or its viewer's knowledge. Charles Bazerman wrote a chapter called Intertextuality, How Texts Rely on Other Text, and in this chapter he points out levels of intertextuality and techniques of intertextuality. Techniques of intertextuality basically demonstrate how to locate intertextuality. So intertextuality could be as simple as a direct quote. It could also be as simple as an indirect quote or referencing a previous text per person or blog post. It can also be directly responding to a text, and that's known as invoking a text, and you see that quite a bit. One of the more recognizable forms of intertextuality is when you see textual fragments embedded in other text. So as this particular quote by Graham Allen points out, authors of literary works borrow language systems, plots, generic features, aspects of characters, and images as a way to help their audiences make sense of their text. So for example, look at all of these movie posters. They're exactly the same. Same thing with a lot of the characters that you see in films and TV and even in the novels that you read. So for example, Austin Powers' Dr. Evil is really just connected to Blofeld from James Bond, and that whole series of movies is connected to James Bond. This particular scene here, if you haven't heard of the Beatles, then this Simpsons reference makes no sense to you. And that happens a lot of times in intertextual references. If you don't know the text being referenced, then sometimes you can't make sense of the intertextual connections. So for example, this particular scene makes significantly more sense if you've actually seen this particular movie. Same thing with Silence of the Lambs. If you haven't seen Silence of the Lambs, then this particular Simpsons scene probably isn't all that unoriginal to you. Here's another example of how intertextual references work in music. Listen to this reference in the Police song. If you haven't heard the text being referenced, then you probably don't get the extra meaning.
It's no use. He sees her. He starts to shake and cough, just like the old man in that book by Nabokov.
Have you ever heard of That Book by Nabokov? Many of you probably haven't, but Vladimir Nabokov wrote a book called Lolita, a famous book about a professor who was a pedophile. He ended up marrying this woman really to get at her 14-year-old daughter. So it's just easier to communicate with each other when we reference texts that we already know. Some of you may have heard of Marilyn Monroe from the 1950s. She's pretty popular. She may even be familiar or look similar to somebody you know that's more recent. Say this person certainly didn't think Madonna conjured up her image all alone. I think you'll realize that most writers, authors, textual creators draw from other text, other ideas, other characters and ideas that are already established in pop culture. It's much easier to reference people we know. So for example, haven't you ever wondered why certain characters on TV look very similar to other characters? Like for example, Archie Bunker from the 70s looks very similar to Al Bundy from Married with Children from the 1980s. And Al Bundy looks very familiar to somebody we all know, Homer Simpson from The Simpsons in the 1990s and still going. And Homer Simpson looks a lot like Family Guy. And I think you'll realize that almost every character we've ever seen on TV or in the movies has been seen and known before. This certainly isn't a new concept. Textual creators have been drawing from each other since the dawn of time. Haven't you ever wondered why so many monsters in pop culture are green? I mean, it can't be a coincidence, but a majority of the monsters we've grown to sort of love and hate are green. So for some reason, the color green has been associated with monsters. And through conscious effort or subconscious effort, textual creators that design and create monsters typically make them green. Characters contain traces and fragments of other characters, and it extends to colors. Sometimes those textual fragments are a bit more difficult to see, like for example, I'm sure that you never thought that this guy and this guy could be connected. And what exactly is that connection? Well, according to House MD website, here are some characteristics that make these two similar. And we see this over and over and over. Even in the previous example of Archie Bunker, Al Bundy, Homer Simpson, and the Family Guy. All of those characters demonstrate similarities. Don't forget your video games either. Games like, for example, Smash Brothers. Taking a collection of game characters and putting them together. You also have things like Punch-Out, games drawing off of other games. Those examples and the examples we just looked at are fairly easy. Now let's look at a little bit more difficult examples, some presupposition type examples. Let's take a look at something called the birth mystery plot. There's a scholar named Brian McCrea up at University of Florida who writes about 18th century British novels. And the birth mystery plot is a big part of that particular genre. And he points out elements of the birth mystery plot. But the thing about the birth mystery plot is it's been around quite a while. It's a plot element that we see all the way back to Oedipus Rex and carrying on through into the 1700s with Henry Fielding's Amelia and Frances Burney's Evelina, two texts that the scholar Brian McCrea actually discusses. And of course there's the most famous birth mystery we've probably ever seen in film. So the interesting thing here is that the birth plot mystery is essentially an intertextual device that movie creators, fiction writers, textual creators in general can use and rely on to help make twists and turns within their stories. Those were some broad examples of intertextuality, and I hope they helped you understand what intertextuality means. Now we're going to apply that understanding of intertextuality to the research process. And I'm going to explain the intertextual explication assignment. And I know it sounds a little intimidating, but it really is very simple. This assignment breaks down into 3 sections. The first section asks you to highlight the intertextual information in the article. The second section asks you to annotate the scholarly article. And this third section asks you to write up a research report based off of the intertextual information you extracted from the article. And I will explain each of these three sections in detail right now. The first thing you want to do is locate a scholarly article of interest and then extract the intertextual information from that article. And intertextual information is key authors, key terms, key texts, and text can be articles or books quoted or referenced in the actual article. So here is an example of a scholarly article introduction, and you'll notice that there are several different names and sources and dates being referenced right away, and that is the intertextual information. And what you want to do to begin this assignment is you want to take that information and you want to put it at the top of your page like this. Remember that intertextual information is what you find throughout the entire scholarly article. It's not just information you find in the introduction of the scholarly article. Here's another student example of the explication assignment. They've got key authors mentioned throughout the article, key terms mentioned throughout the article, key text mentioned throughout the article. All of this information constitutes the intertextual information. And once you find this, you're ready to move on to the next part of the assignment, which is writing an annotation of the scholarly article. And all an annotation is a summary of the scholarly article. And here's an example of that. An annotation is just an academic way of saying a summary. It's a summary, but it's a little bit more detailed. So your annotation for this particular assignment should be a couple paragraphs long, and it should basically highlight the important parts of the article. Once you're done with that particular part of the assignment, you'll move on to the most important part of the assignment, and that's the research report. The research report asks you to use the intertextual information you explicated from the scholarly article as a way to continue to search for information about a particular topic and conversation. So you have key terms, key authors, key text, key dates that you can use as a way to locate more sources in a particular conversation. So instead of searching randomly, you now have authors and terms and texts that are connected to the conversation that you're interested in. This will keep you from randomly searching things. And the research report is not a deep search. It's a sort of superficial search. So you might type in a key term and tell me in the research report what that term means and how it might influence the direction of your future research. Here are a couple student examples. And you'll notice that a lot of the information that is being presented in these research reports is somewhat generic. The research report is not designed to be deep. Like I said, this particular assignment is designed to teach you how to take a scholarly article, extract intertextual information from that article, and then use the intertextual information from the article as a way to continue searching for information in a particular topic or conversation. Students here have looked up key names, key text, typed them in to say Google or one of the UCF databases, and highlighted what they found. And then the research report should end with a small paragraph that explains where you're headed as a result of this assignment. So how has this particular assignment helped you explore different areas within a particular topic or conversation? So that concludes the explanation for the explication of a scholarly article assignment. And like I said, this assignment basically teaches you how to pull apart a scholarly article for intertextuality and then use those intertextual elements to continue searching within a particular conversation. So now I'm going to move on and discuss the research proposal. The research proposal is easy and hard because it's the getting started assignment. So the research proposal asks you to essentially find a research question and then validate that research question. And by validate, I mean prove to me that the research question that you want to answer for the rest of the summer is actually an important, relevant research question to engage in. That other people that study this particular area and other people that participate in this particular conversation also believe that the question you want to answer is actually important too. So you'll notice that the assignment guidelines has a few things that your research proposal will need. And number one is your proposal should be built around a relevant research question. I think that's going to be the most difficult thing to find. Number two is you've got to have evidence. That means you need scholarly articles and references and quotes from those particular articles that demonstrate the validity of your question. You also need to point out who benefits from this particular research question and why. And then you need to hint at what it might take to answer the question. Will you need to interview students, teachers? Will you need to conduct a survey? Will you need to observe somebody? Will you need to analyze other people's studies? Will you need to look at somebody's writing process? So the research proposal is easy because it has clear guidelines that you need to meet. But it's difficult because finding a relevant research question is not easy. So I've given you some examples of some research proposals, and all of these examples can be found online in our Canvas course. So notice this first example identifies the research question at the top, and then it attempts to validate that question with references and quotes from scholarship. And notice that the references and quotes from these sources are a little bit different than, say, the way you've probably used sources in the past. Most of you have been taught to use sources to answer questions or just to sort of summarize something, but using a source to validate a question is a little bit different than using a source to answer a question or to summarize information. So be careful, because that's really the skill that's being assessed in this particular assignment. So notice how these research proposals identify a particular question, and then notice how they try to validate that question with actual references. So pay attention to what those quotes and references are doing different, because when you try to validate a question and you're looking for references and quotes to do that, a lot of times you don't find a reference or a quote in a source that says, hey, this question is great. You have to make inferences. You have to make indirect assumptions about your sources. So remember to read the proposal guidelines carefully and the explication of a scholarly article assignment guidelines very carefully, and go back through all of the samples and examples that I provided in Canvas and make sure to read over those very carefully. I think that this video has given you a little bit more understanding of those particular assignments, but by no means is this a supplement for reading the guidelines and the student examples and asking questions. And remember, a lot of the assignments that we're going to do in each module will help us understand and build on those particular assignments. So even though some of the information in this video may still not be as clear as you'd like it to be, remember that the modules are designed to teach you more about these particular assignments and why we're doing them and the benefits of actually completing these assignments. So thanks for watching, and I will talk to you in the next video.